Good afternoon, everyone. Apologies for that slight delay. Welcome. Connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on social media. On YouTube, subscribe to @Grade Level Reading. On LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram, you can follow us at Campaign for GLR. And on Twitter or X, you can follow us at Reading by Third. Once again, welcome everyone. My name is Leah Cruz, and I'll be behind the scenes helping produce the conversation today for the campaign. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge our enterprise and programmatic funders, as well as our individual donors. So your support not only helps us hold these conversations weekly, but it also helps us create meaningful opportunities to share insights with each other, hold vital conversations, foster connections, and really build our CGLR community. So thank you. And then a few housekeeping tips before we get started. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself. So please use that chat box in the bottom of your screen to share your name and city or organization. And be sure to select everyone instead of hosts and panelists to make sure that we all know who's here and we're all speaking to each other. All of attendees are in listen only mode, but we encourage you to engage during the session, both through the chat box and by posting questions in the Q&A for our panelists. We will dedicate the last portion of the webinar to respond live to the questions that you post, and our panelists will also be typing out responses to some of those questions throughout the webinar. It is being recorded and we are live streaming on Facebook. The links to everything that we talk about will be shared in the chat during the session, as well as afterwards. We'll have slides, bios, and all the resources will be shared in a follow-up for anyone who's registered for the webinar. And then lastly, we will have a brief evaluation that comes up during the Q&A or somewhere near the end of the session. Please take a moment to fill that out. We highly encourage you to respond. This really helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. And as a team, the campaign really takes your feedback seriously and incorporates it into our planning. And then we do have a few upcoming sessions we wanted to highlight before I turn it over to Hillary. So we have Crucible of Practice Salon next Tuesday at 12:30. About rural communities. So if you're in a rural community or you support rural communities, that will be a really important session. We are also continuing our More Hopeful Futures or Children as Collateral Damage series, and we'll be discussing SNAP next week, so the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So that'll also be a critical conversation at 3 p.m. next week. And then the following Tuesday, we will have a funder conversation about children's multimedia programming. We'll have some PBS things going on during that one. And then we have a Material Hardship Matters Parent Voices from the Rapid Survey. So that is in the afternoon on the 17th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. So make sure you tune into those. You can register at the link that's been dropped in the chat. And with that, I will turn it over to Hillary Jones, who is a senior consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Hillary, all you.
Thank you, Leah, and welcome everyone. Thank you for introducing yourself in the chat, and thank you for joining us for our session today entitled The Foundation of EdTech is Connection, Ensuring Universal Access to the Internet. At the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, our civic action and advocacy agenda has long prioritized one piece, that is advancing digital connectivity and ensuring universal access to the internet. And so we recognize in this current digital age that internet is not a luxury. It's important and essential for learning, for family engagement, for all of the things that our young people need. And so this conversation today is both timely and essential as we see the home connectivity gap widening. And so we believe that conversations like this today are part of ensuring that universal and equitable internet access begins with focusing on improving outcomes for children from economically challenged, fragile, and marginalized families. And it requires intentional collaboration, not just among institutions, some of which you'll see represented here today, but with people and communities most proximate to those challenges And we have the privilege of hearing from some of them. So that's where we're starting today. But in June and July, CGLR is going to host a technology-enhanced teaching and learning summer institute in which we'll discuss the promise, progress, and potential pitfalls around EdTech. But we can't do this without starting with digital connectivity. And that's why we're having this conversation today. So I just dropped in the chat the link for our EdTech Institute, and we hope you'll join us for that as well. But today we'll talk about why connectivity still matters in 2025, what we're considering around the current legislative context. We'll look at the digital divide and understand where the gaps are, as well as hear innovative solutions and policy solutions that are addressing this issue. So at this time, I'd like to welcome our panelists for the day. I'm going to share their complete bios in the chat, but we have with us Kristen Corra, who is the policy counsel with the Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition and works to address broadband needs in policies. We have Amina Fazlullah, the head of tech policy advocacy at Common Sense Media, and the person who provided us a reminder of the need for this timely conversation in the context of the work that we're doing. Kiarra Lewis, the leadership support coordinator at the Patterson Foundation. Bree MacPhee Lyon is the program director at EducationSuperHighway and leads their advocacy work and programs. Licia Villalta is the resident services manager at the Housing Authority of the City of Los Angeles and oversees their digital equity initiatives. And last but not least is our moderator for today's conversation. Jisoo Song is the director of projects and initiatives at the State Education Technology Directors Association, where he supports and advocates for the implementation of EdTech policies and promising practices. And so now I'm going to pass over the conversation to Jisoo.
Awesome. Thank you, Hillary, for that introduction. And thank you for inviting me to moderate this chat. As Hillary mentioned, my name is Jisoo Song, Director of Projects and Initiatives over at CETA. If you're unfamiliar with our organization, we're a professional association that represents state EdTech and digital learning leaders from about 40 member states, as well as affiliate regional organizations and corporate member organizations that share our mission and vision. Before my role at CETA, I previously served as an advisor at the Office of EdTech at the U.S. Department of Education, where I had a chance to lead our digital access initiatives and support the development of the 2024 National EdTech Plan, which is the flagship EdTech policy document of the federal government. Last year, CETA launched the Universal Connectivity Imperative, or the UCI initiative, to take stock of what we've learned about the digital access divide so we can properly chart the way forward. And the objectives of that initiatives were to assess the state of digital access in K-12, explore strategies that states are using to address home digital access, and provide some federal and state policy recommendations for moving forward. And in the report, we highlighted the progress that we've been able to make in the past 5 years through critical programs like BEAD, E-Rate, ECF, ACP, ESSER, the Alphabet Super programs that I'm sure we'll talk about over the next hour and a half. And we're really at an interesting intersection point because many of these funds have gone away or are facing some political scrutiny at this moment. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation about the investments that we need to continue to make if we're going to close the digital divide that bars so many students and families still from educational opportunities and a lot more. So Amina, I'm gonna point my first question to you. Just help us set the stage here. A lot of folks, coming after the pandemic, may assume that since students have returned to school, physical school buildings, connectivity challenges don't deserve too much attention, shouldn't matter anymore. What's your thoughts on that?
That's a really common opinion. I think there was a sense that after remote learning ended and everybody was back in person, that there could be a step back from thinking about the connectivity challenges that communities were facing. But that actually doesn't work, mainly because for anybody who's been engaged on thinking through what connectivity means in the educational context. We've been thinking about this well before the pandemic began, and we'll continue thinking about it after. And the reason for that is because technology is a tool that's being used in the classroom. It's a tool that's being used by students. It is a tool that's necessary to be able to effectively advance education. It can help support and boost capacity for various resources. It can help scaffold students when there are less resources potentially available in person, or additional resources are needed to follow a student. And of course, there are innovations that are around the corner, like AI, that are quickly being considered and even in use within the context of education. And there are limitations to how deeply students and teachers can take advantage of those tools. And we certainly want to avoid further deepening disparities in educational outcomes and access related to technology use. Because as we know, there's going to be, ever-changing innovations coming down the pike. And so, we've already seen how disparities in access to technology can impact student outcomes and student ability to be able to take advantage of technology. So all of that is still true, still the case. We've done a little bit of research into what students are doing around AI. And, our initial research found that, and this is like months ago now, and numbers have probably changed, that 7 in 10 students were already using AI in some capacity. And part of that experience might be on a cell phone or on a tablet. Some of that, is limiting. And so, again, like the promise of other technologies that come before AI, when we think about, how could AI open up developing programs by supporting somebody who wants to code but doesn't have a ton of experience coding. Those types of applications require a robust device, require robust connectivity, require more time than you've got when you're, potentially sitting after school, or maybe, sitting outside of McDonald's. So, you want to make sure that you're scaffolding students with the foundational pieces to make sure they can take advantage of technology. And just as a reminder, we did some scoping work, and we found that there are about 16 million kids across the country that are in what we call the persistent digital divide, lacking access to either the connectivity they need, the consistent access to the connectivity that they need to be able to engage in educational resources, and/or lacking the access to a device that meets grade-specific needs. And when you leave these kids in the digital divide, we estimate that they will have lower GPAs, lower annual incomes, and that leaves the country with a potential $33 billion annual GDP loss, plus additional public costs. So leaving these kids behind has a significant impact on everyone, not just those children. And we know that there have been a lot of efforts made to support connectivity. In the early days of the pandemic, we saw, or throughout the pandemic, we saw different programs supporting connectivity. The Emergency Connectivity Fund, I think, was a proof of concept that the demand is real, that these 16 million kids in the persistent digital divide are out there. The program allocated about $7 billion to support connectivity and devices for students through either schools or libraries. The program went out the door quickly, and the evidence in terms of the requests that came in showed that there was significant unmet need. I mean, some states still had like 88% unmet need, 82% unmet need, 78% unmet unmet need. So like it's an issue that persists, and it will have follow-on impacts on the ability of schools, students, families as a whole to be able to take advantage of innovations in education.
Thank you so much for your response. Yeah, at CETA, we've been advocating for the need to really modernize the way we think about school. And obviously, we can't do that without that foundational digital access. So I really appreciated our co-advocacy to fight the myth of like not needing to fight the digital access divide anymore, even back when I was at the Department of Ed. Kristen, I want to go to you for my next question. One policy lever that Amina talked about that has greatly helped, connect school buildings is E-rate. Can you give us a brief primer on E-rate for those in the audience that might not be as familiar, as well as some of the flexibilities that the FCC provided during the pandemic and how Congress is currently reviewing some key elements of the program?
Yeah, absolutely. Just as by way of introduction really quickly, I'm Kristen Corra and I'm Policy Counsel at Shelby, the Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition. And Shelby is a nonprofit advocacy organization based out of DC, and we advocate for policies and programs that enable anchor institutions like schools and libraries and healthcare clinics to obtain and promote open, high-quality broadband to support connectivity for all. So because we deal a lot with schools and libraries, and healthcare clinics as anchor institutions, as Jisoo said, we're very familiar with the E-rate program and also the rural healthcare program under the Universal Service Fund. So specifically, the E-rate program provides a subsidy for K through 12 schools and libraries to help them obtain internet connectivity, so equipment and the service that they need to bring internet to those anchor institutions. And so as Jisoo was alluding to, we saw some really interesting developments with E-rate over the last couple of years. So at the end of 2023, the FCC adopted a declaratory ruling basically saying that school bus Wi-Fi was eligible for support under E-rate. So now we saw a situation where school buses could be outfitted with Wi-Fi capability to help students stay connected and connect their school-issued laptops to the school network during long commutes from home and to school, or while they're on some sort of school-related trip. So that was an interesting development that we saw, and definitely a need. We saw some, schools really advocating for this and applying for funding. And then just recently, about July, I believe, of last year, the FCC adopted a new hotspot lending program. And that lending program would also be supported with E-rate funds. And here, the gist is that schools and libraries can apply for hotspot devices and lines of service in their E-rate applications. And so this funding year 2025 was the first funding year where they could actually apply for this. And we saw schools and libraries actually apply. So we saw more than 8,000 schools and libraries nationwide apply for the program support, requesting funding for over 200,000 hotspot connections. So that really shows a demand, and sort of following what Amina said, after the expiration of the ECF program, we are really seeing this program, step up to help keep students connected that may have devices through programs like ECF, and also to help, new students through new hotspot devices as well. And what's really, really interesting is that with this hotspot lending program, there are really a lot of financial and programmatic rules associated with the program. It really seems like the FCC wanted to be very prudent with this. They wanted to make sure that they were helping, students and library patrons in need that really needed the connection to stay connected at home, off campus. So there are a lot of mechanisms to make this work. There's a specific budget that schools and libraries have to work within. There are caps on the costs associated for support for, hotspot devices and lines of service. There's rules around usage and warehousing, and then of course filtering to make sure that content remains, safe for students and library patrons as they use those devices. Now I know, Jisoo, I would be remiss if we didn't talk about what's actually, currently happening with the hotspot program specifically. So if you will, I'll just explain a little bit about what we're seeing right now. So fast forwarding to today, the hotspot lending order is now at risk of being overturned by a congressional resolution. And that resolution is authorized under something called the Congressional Review Act. I won't really go into the nitty-gritty of the Congressional Review Act and what that all entails, but given the timing of the FCC's adoption of the hotspot order and reporting those rules to Congress, unfortunately that item has fallen within the CRA period, so Congress has the ability to roll that program if they want to. Last month, we did see the Senate take a vote on that resolution to roll back the hotspot program, and the vote was approved. So this resolution is currently sitting at the House. So as of right now, Shelby and other organizations are trying to have meetings with House representatives to, talk to them about the importance of this program and what would happen if they rolled back this program for the schools and libraries that have already applied for funding this funding year. And so we're really, trying to make sure they understand the implications of this. And what's really imperative to understand here is that through a congressional resolution like this, if it is approved and voted on by the House and the Senate and goes up the chain, it would prevent the FCC from being able to issue a similar rule in the future. So this action could be really detrimental, especially if we have congressional members that maybe agree with the spirit of the bill or the spirit of the FCC's rules, but maybe they have some issues with some of the rules. Using this avenue could really be detrimental to the future of that program. So I would be remiss if I didn't say what the current status of that program stands now, but we really did see some interesting, innovative ways, through the E-rate program, where the FCC is really trying to keep students and library patrons connected past some of these other temporary programs that we saw expire.
Thank you. And as someone from a policy background and a former ed staffer, I can talk about these issues forever, but that's not the sole purpose of this webinar. So I'll just keep us moving forward. I want to get down to some of the actual barriers faced by students and families and communities. So Bree, I want to maybe go to you for my next question. All these programs that I talked about, that Amina talked about and Kristen talked about, can you tell us about the actual impact of these programs on deploying infrastructure, ensuring affordability? What happens if we don't continue to support these programs?
Thank you so much, Jisoo, and thank you everyone for being here. Like Hillary introduced me, I'm Bree MacPhee Lyon. I'm a program director at EducationSuperHighway. Our mission is to close the digital divide for the estimated 17 million households that have access to the internet but cannot afford to connect. We very much focus on communities where we deem about 25% of the community is unconnected, so the most unconnected households in the US. And of that, let's say 122 million households, about 28 million households do not have access to high-speed broadband. And what we're really honing in on at EducationSuperHighway is this notion with the conversation being about infrastructure and access are so critical. The affordability piece is just as critical. And programs such as the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment, the BEAD program, like Jisoo mentioned earlier, it was created by part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act. It had another element to it, the Digital Equity Act funds and program that was just terminated earlier in May. And there's also the Affordable Connectivity Program, the ACP program, which was another $14.2 billion program, also expired last year. So we have this this sort of conundrum where infrastructure is being paid attention to. $42.5 billion are being put into infrastructure across the nation with BEAD, so broadband equity, access, and deployment. But the counterpart, the other consideration, is this affordability piece. And as more and more networks come online, we estimated specifically 16.3 million households will get access to the internet, have access to the internet, and still not will be able to connect or stay connected. We even think that that may be as high as another 3 million households have access to the internet, have episodic access. It's static. They connect, they lose it. It's an affordability piece. And so about 19 million households have the continued barrier of affordability. And so part of the conversation has to be that infrastructure, of course, matters. Affordability is just as critical. And what we call this like affordability gap, or the broadband affordability gap at Education Superhighway, has to be part of the conversation. And so really we're in this critical moment where Congress has acted, we have programs, we have funding, we have billions of dollars in funding. We can connect all households with a minimum of 100 over 20 megabits per second. But if folks can't connect, those networks come online, we're going to still see those barriers persist. We're still going to see those gaps persist for our students, for their families, for households that still do not have access at home, for their education, for their homework, for their families to even access opportunities through workforce development, telehealth. We know how critical all of that is. And the fear is that if we just focus on infrastructure, we don't continue the conversation around affordability, that we're going to leave 16.3 million households and maybe as many as 19 million households offline.
Thank you so much for that overview. Kiarra, going to you, I know that the Patterson Foundation has really prioritized in closing the digital access divide. From a more comprehensive standpoint, what might be some of the reasons why we've yet to solve for this issue?
Of course, thank you so much for allowing me to share. So a little bit of context, the Patterson Foundation, also known as TPF, first began looking at the digital divide during the pandemic, as did many others, because our local CGLR Suncoast Campaign for Grade Level Reading team noticed that many families were not easily making that quick transition to online learning, which led us to discovering why is that and what's happening. And we later learned that it's because they lacked one or more or all of the three essential elements that you can see listed on the right-hand side of the screen. And it wasn't just impacting students' ability to learn, but even their parents' ability to work, and it was just impacting the entire family, as it still does today. And it's really those early observations and questions that led TPF to create a new initiative called Digital Access for All in June of 2020 to really explore and do a deep dive into what is this digital divide and who is working to provide access to one or more or all of these essential elements. If we could pull up my next slide that has some data that I'd like to share, not to do a deep dive into it, but just because when we looked at it, it made it really clear to us that the digital divide certainly does exist in our four-county focus area. And some of the reasons why are because of barriers that are related to access, affordability, and awareness, which you will continue to hear throughout the webinar today. And the pandemic was only exacerbating the gap that already existed. And although 2023 data, which is not pictured, but shows that these areas are decreasing in terms of percentages, we are very mindful that that may be progress, but everyone deserves access to digital technology to fully participate in society, not just a part of our community. And provisions like ACP allow the Patterson Foundation to demonstrate a key approach for us, which is our more than money approach, recognizing that a funder can have an impact beyond just providing funding or giving a grant. So our focus was really on raising awareness and access to the affordable and emerging digital resources that exist in our community and beyond, but also supporting families and communities in adopting those resources. The magic really does first happen when people know what's available. There's like a spark that's lit, but it really shines when we help them make most of the resources that exist. So due to ACP, we created a sub-initiative called The Gap to close the gap originally between those we know were ACP eligible and those who were ACP enrolled. Now that the ACP is no longer with us, we've kind of transitioned our focus, but using a team of TPF consultants, we're attending community events at schools, at health departments to meet people where they are at, literally, with our most popular being SCGLR's pop-up laundry through events at Laundry-O-Mats. And each time we connect, it's not just, here's a flyer, have a good day, but it's really, let's have a conversation about your family's digital access needs. And let's connect you to one of our amazing TPF digital navigators or someone in our network to get you enrolled in what works for you. And so our gap engagers, even though our focus has shifted away from ACP to the other resources that exist in our community, it's still about spreading awareness and getting people connected. That's really the heart of it.
Thank you. And thanks for calling out the Affordable Connectivity Program. When I was at the Department of Education, we launched a public-private partnership called the Online for All campaign, working with about, I think, 400 nonprofits and community organizations to spread awareness about the ACP until the funds, unfortunately, ran dry last year. So that was a really great way to see community organizations step up to make sure that their communities are empowered and we're able to afford broadband. So again, thank you so much for sharing what you're all doing at Patterson Foundation. Amina, going back to you, can you provide your reactions to all this data and information? Obviously with the accelerating pace of technology adoption in our schools and communities, what can we really do to continue empowering individuals as we saw for the digital access divide?
Yeah, so I mean, with the end of ACP, the conclusion of the Emergency Connectivity Fund, the end of a lot of other pandemic era programs supporting connectivity, the potential rollback of the hotspot program through E-rate. At the federal level, it's pretty grim in terms of what supports are available to students. And, I think one thing that educators and anyone who is supporting a student right now should be cognizant of is that the connectivity landscape in terms of support for those students is quickly changing. It is much more volatile than it's been in sort of the past 2 to 3 years. A lot of the supports that we may have grown accustomed to are likely either, ending, terming out, or removed altogether. So it's really important to sort of think differently and to keep that in mind, right? So we've got to be a little bit more dynamic when we're thinking about how do we want to use technology with students. How can we be mindful of the fact that their technology situation might change over time? So you might have a student who at the start of the school year is totally connected and fine, and then due to affordability issues, sort of falls off of connectivity. And so be cognizant of like checking in with students periodically to make sure that they have the resources, not just checking in once at the top of the year, but like making sure that they still have access. And it can be difficult. It could be difficult for the kids to know why. It could be hard for parents to speak up that they need the help. So keeping that in mind, being thoughtful about how you use your technology so that there are offline and online options that don't leave families behind if potentially they need to do something without connectivity. That can also be helpful. Creating in-school spaces for the more sort of bandwidth intensive projects or the projects that require better devices. If students aren't able to have access to those devices and you can't guarantee that they're going to have a high quality connectivity at home, that connectivity doesn't become a barrier to them. So just keeping that sort of volatile connectivity landscape in mind throughout the school year and when you're considering how you want to use technology, I think is important to do in this current era.
There's certainly a lot going on, right? So I think it's kind of easy to sort of fall into the trap of saying, this is all too much and kind of give in, right? So I just want to transition the conversation a little bit to solutions and particularly some of the innovations for a second. A previous mentor of mine has told me that innovation doesn't always have to look like new technologies, new tools. It might be using existing systems and institutions in new ways to deliver program services a lot more efficiently. And this is where anchor institutions obviously, excel at, right? So Kristen, Shelby, obviously your members consist of those anchor institutions. Can you tell us about them, define them a little bit for us, and the innovative functions that they serve?
Absolutely. So anchor institutions, really the best way to define them is through certain characteristics that we might see amongst all of them. So they're usually place-based, right? They're rooted in their local communities. They typically have a long-term commitment to the area, so they don't typically move around a lot. They're pretty stable. And then they also have a commitment to the well-being of that community. So they're there to provide certain services to help improve social and economic health of their community members. So common examples, as evidenced by our organization's name, would be schools, healthcare clinics, and libraries. But they can also include gathering places for community members, so recreational centers or even houses of worship. We've definitely seen a lot of examples and ways in which anchors are being used. And what's really interesting is that throughout the BEAD process, I know somebody brought up BEAD earlier, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. There was a really interesting, what I call exercise. I know it's more than that, but states had to actually create an inventory of anchor institutions in their jurisdiction that lacked access to gigabit level broadband service. And in doing so, they were able to define what an anchor institution is for their jurisdiction. So, of course, they had to justify why a certain type of organization was qualified to be an anchor. And in doing so, they had to explain how the institution facilitated greater use of broadband service by vulnerable populations. That was specifically in the definition by the NTIA. So here we really saw another characteristic of anchors, certainly in the broadband world, including organizations that facilitate greater use of broadband service. So now sort of in terms of the question about innovative solutions involving anchors, of course, we just talked about, schools and libraries sort of stepping into this role where they're providing things like hotspots and school bus Wi-Fi to help with connectivity off campus. But there's also other instances of schools and libraries doing some really innovative things in terms of managing and operating broadband networks. So Shelby has actually highlighted what we call deploying networks, broadband networks to and through an anchor institution. So here we have seen anchors actually partnering most of the time with broadband providers, different types of providers, in order to help extend connectivity out into the community. So an example I always like to give here is a school or library might lease out space on the rooftops of their building or buildings, multiple buildings, for a provider to perhaps build a tower. And so once that tower is up, the radios can then beam out signal into the community. And so students who have laptops and they take those laptops home, school issued laptops, they can then connect back to the school's network. So sometimes we'll see a provider who actually installs a little receiver on the student's home. And so boom, once the student gets home, they open up their laptop, they can connect directly back to that school network. And oftentimes these models provide free or very low cost options to these families. But it really is an interesting partnership between, an anchor institution and a provider, to get that provider to come to that area and help in this situation. And there are so many different models of this. And I think Hillary might have put the link into the chat. We actually commissioned a case study document that will highlight, I think it's 12 different case studies of this type of partnership between anchors and providers. So if you'd like to read more about what others are doing there, you can do so. So really, really fun, interesting use of existing infrastructure through anchors.
Thank you so much. Kiarra, going to you. What solutions have you seen from the community organizations that you serve and convene at the Patterson Foundation?
Absolutely. So for the Patterson Foundation, digital navigation has certainly been key. It may not be new in concept, but I'd like to think it was definitely new to our Suncoast region. Understanding that it works, in 2021, TPF piloted our very own digital navigator program as part as DA4A. 3 local nonprofits were invited to be part of that pilot, one serving Hispanic students and families, another providing women with support and resources, and another one being our local Goodwill. Again, using our more than money approach to philanthropy, TPF hired a consultant to join our DA4A team and focusing on training those 3 pilot organizations at no cost to them to learn how can they embed responsibilities of the digital navigation into the work that they were already doing in their organization. And I like to think of digital navigators, to those who may have not heard that term, as digital social workers. It's not just here's what exists, now go and get it. But it's really here's what exists and let's explore it and get it together, because we understand the digital landscape, especially if it's new to you, can be very intimidating, and that in itself can be a barrier. For example, now at our local Goodwill, Minnesota, if someone comes in looking for a job, of course they're going to help them look for the job, but they're also going to take a pause and ask a couple questions. Do you have connectivity? Do you have devices? Or do you even have the skills and support needed to make the most of a device or the internet? And it certainly makes sense for an organization like Goodwill, since we know the 3 essential elements affects one's ability to find a job in today's digital world. And it does certainly affect the student's ability to succeed in school. Fast forward to today, if you look at the screen, you can see a couple of key takeaways and impact. We are proud now to officially have a Suncoast Digital Navigator Network, and we do have plans this year to launch a 4th cohort in DeSoto County, which is one of our smallest or most rural of our 4 county focus area. 2 additional quick ways that we are leveraging our assets to make an impact in this digital access space is first, earlier this year in March, we hosted a Suncoast Connect, a full day symposium convening individuals and organizations, those who are new, those who are expert, just a full day conversation on the digital divide, digital access, and over 200 people attended and really left away either learning something new, developing new partnerships, or being inspired with new solutions that in small ways that them as an individual or as an organization can work in tandem with everyone else to start closing the digital divide in our own backyard. As part of Suncoast Connect, leading up to it, and of course continuing the momentum after, we launched our first LinkedIn group, which of course everyone here is invited to join, to continue the conversation of what's happening, what's working, and maybe what's not working, because we definitely want to learn from people, whether it be people in our 4 county region or people nationally, because whatever is working, we definitely want to bring it here so that it can work in our own backyard. Second, you might see on the lower right-hand corner a logo for an organization down here called the Sarasota Technology Users Group. The Patterson Foundation continues to use its assets to host an annual device drive to support the Sarasota Technology Users Group, which is a volunteer-driven refurbishing organization that does its work for free and give devices to those in need for free as well. We have worked with them to secure devices for hundreds of our digital navigation clients who just can't afford to go to an Amazon or a Walmart or an Apple to buy a computer. So using our capacity, our resources, we host these device drives, market it, collect the devices, and we hand it to them so that they can refurbish it and get it back into the community to those who really need it. And for our last drive, we are proud to say we raised over 400 devices that will be given back to those in need in our community. So those are just a couple of ways we're trying to make an impact down here.
And thank you for that work. Digital navigators certainly do some amazing stuff out there. In the previous administration, we had a chance to take Deputy Secretary of Education Cindy Martin down to the Charlotte region to talk to some of the digital navigators based out of the Center for Digital Equity over there. And we definitely left inspired by their work. So props to you all for launching all of that stuff. Bree, going to you for a second. I know EdSuperHighway has shifted the organization's mission a little bit in recent years to focus more on the issue of connectivity, especially in like multi-dwelling units. Can you talk a little bit about that work?
Thank you.
going to sunset and close, but then the pandemic hit, and superintendents, directors of technology and IT were coming to us saying, you got our children and our students online in their classrooms to high-speed internet, but now they're home and they don't have access, and we can't get them access. Dwelling units, think apartment buildings, multiple units. And so we know that that's a critical group to focus on and a priority group that needs to be addressed for their affordability and accessibility needs. And in particular, with MDUs, the maps, like Kristen was mentioning, there was an inventory done where states were going through, looking at their who's connected, the locations that were connected. A lot of these locations were actually considered served. They had an internet access, but it was to a community room, an office building, the main office, and not to the unit. And so we were recognizing that just like federal funds could be used to address high-speed internet for school classrooms, multi-dwelling units were going to be left behind if their access wasn't addressed. And looking at it very superficially, it looked like they were, that to the unit connectivity wasn't in existence. And so one of the innovative solutions we've been advocating for, and we're very happy that through our work and other partner work across the nation, a multi-dwelling unit and apartment Wi-Fi model, which is sort of the innovative solution that we're proposing and working on with states, is an eligible use of BEAD funds, so the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Funds. And what that means is that the infrastructure cost, that capital cost to get that unit level connectivity is now possible. And prior to this, internet providers, others may not have deemed it an affordable cost for them. They did not want to invest that much money. So we have a real opportunity currently to ensure that states don't overlook this group that lives in multi-dwelling units and very much are almost a quarter of the digital divide. And so addressing them could be, could make a great strides for universal access in their states. And just a quick overview, apartment Wi-Fi, think wireless access points throughout the building, very much like you'd see at a hotel. The residents can get instant access and connected immediately. We've seen a lot of barriers lifted because managing a modem and how to troubleshoot and all of that is usually dealt with a managed service provider. Actually, you see some are in the space today. And so that work is so critical because taking away as many layers and barriers as possible, and then also having an affordable program is what's really critical for this group. And just anecdotally, I was previously at the Madison Metropolitan School District in Madison, Wisconsin. My students were living in affordable MDUs and didn't have access during COVID. And I lived this. I found out that there was a community room that 45 children could have gotten online and done their classwork, their schoolwork, and been on their Zoom classrooms. But in a time when social distancing was so critical, they weren't able to do so. And internet service providers weren't funding the infrastructure costs and the capital costs. And so again, just to reiterate, the infrastructure is so critical, but that affordability piece is necessary. And we are at this position right now where we don't want to have MDUs and those that reside in MDUs left behind and deprioritized or not part of the priority that states are focusing on in the coming months with finalizing their proposals for BEAD.
Thank you so much. Licia, folks might not think firsthand that their local housing authorities might be champions of digital access. Can you tell us a bit about your housing authority's digital ambassadors program? And if there are folks out there trying to replicate your model, what lessons do you have for them? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Jisoo. And I think I agree with Bree on we must continue to advocate for digital access and connectivity. I think it's a very important time right now. And with that, Licia Villalta, Resident Services Manager for the Housing Authority of the City of Los Angeles. I oversee our digital equity and inclusion programs. At the moment, we have 2 programs that are running One is the Digital Ambassadors Program, and the second one is the Career Connect program. And yes, I think what really makes our Digital Ambassadors Program truly unique is its foundation in community, youth, and leadership, right? So last cohort, we graduated 56 digital ambassadors, and we have 22 digital ambassadors for the second cohort. We have leveraged federal and state and local funding, not only to ensure internet connectivity and access, but also we have built a human infrastructure, which is really key to not just keeping folks connected, but to building those relationships so that we can continue to connect folks to the internet. And I think one of the wonderful things has been that by training our youth from our 14 public housing communities in digital literacy and equipping them to be the support that their neighbors need, who need it the most, we have been able to really spread the word on connectivity. But we have also grown as a program. We continue to get local funding because our program is doing so well in terms of like it being a local recognized program, but now a national recognized program. And we have two programs, as I mentioned. One is our Career Connect program, which is a very innovative program that supports folks that are coming out of homelessness into temporary housing. And so what the digital ambassadors do is they actually go out to different temporary housing spaces like hotels or motels in the LA area. And they do a pop-up lab. And so within that pop-up lab, they bring internet access by having hotspots, as well as having laptops for folks to use and be able to apply to jobs, be able to troubleshoot any technology need that the residents may need, and also ensure that residents really know how to access essential online services such as benefits, also resume creation, so that they're able to eventually get a job, right, and become like great members of society. And I think one of the results that we are seeing from the Digital Ambassadors Program is that our youth are really stepping into full-time roles within our organization. So they're starting as digital ambassadors, right, and supporting their communities, but then they're also applying to full-time roles, full-time jobs within our organization. And we're seeing them really grow and develop. And I think that's really powerful, right? It's a really powerful pipeline for our community-based workforce development, which we want to definitely encourage our participants, because they do come from our public housing communities, and we want to ensure that they know that there are other programs out there, such as the Digital Ambassadors Program, where they can explore different tech careers or different careers that they would want to go into eventually as full-time. And I think one of the lessons, right, that we've learned throughout these cohorts and by serving these youth and supporting them and coaching them and really fostering their intellectual knowledge is that digital inclusion isn't just about infrastructure, it's about trust, it's about culture and really relevance and being on top of things in terms of innovation. And so who do you think knows how to use AI best, right? It's going to be our youth, right? And so what is innovation coming up in our near future? It's really AI. It's really all the technology that's coming towards us that we are, really in need to learn quickly, but really not forget about our communities, our low income communities that actually need it the most. So why not teach them as well? And so again, I think communities should really invest in models that empower residents, especially youth, to be a part of the solution, right? Especially in this very, very critical moment. Our digital ambassadors didn't just implement digital programs, they actually help reimagine them, especially after ACP. I know we've been mentioning ACP a bit here, but after the sunset, they were able to come to the table and bring forward innovative ideas that were grounded in real experiences that really helped to sustain momentum and keep people connected. We connected them to affordable ISP providers, and they are now connecting families to affordable connectivity plans. And so one of our primary ISP providers is Starry. And really, we've been able to connect so many folks to plans that are between $15 and $25 a month, which is really good for an internet plan. Of course, not compared to ACP, but really close to it. And so I think the thing is to really move and leverage the people that we have, the youth that we have in place, but also continue to innovate, right? And not stop there on where can we get more funding, but really leverage the resources that we have, as mentioned before. We also leverage the Digital Equity and Inclusion Week to have ISP providers continue to come out and continue to connect folks to the internet. I really do believe in youth development. I'm very passionate about supporting youth and seeing them really grow and develop, but bring in innovation. I think that when we center their voices and we bring them to the table, I think that we don't just close the digital divide, but we transform it into a bridge of like opportunity for the rest of our communities that need it the most.
I want to harken back to something that you said early on around human infrastructure. When we were developing the National EdTech Plan and other federal guidance related to digital access, we quickly learned from a lot of community advocates that for a lot of students and families coming from historically disadvantaged backgrounds, making sure that information is coming from trusted sources is just so important for the sustainability of getting folks online, right? So great to see that your organization and organizations like yours are recognizing this issue, building on it, and making sure that you're leveraging your digital ambassadors program to solve for this issue. So thank you for the work. Closing out this section, Kristen, we'll start with you and then open up the conversation to the rest of the panel. What advice do you have after hearing all of these panelists? What advice do you have for, community leaders who want to get started with this work, are in the midst of all this work? Yeah, what's your take on it?
Yeah, absolutely. So great question. I know we've talked about a lot of different things, and it's like, what do we do with this information? How do we get started? At the start of this, just in terms of anchor institutions, I'll say that, those institutions are always going to be the places where people go for services and resources, right? Again, they're place-based, they're there, they're stable in the community. But as community needs evolve, especially with our digital-driven society, anchors need to be able to keep up with the demands, right? And especially in increased connectivity. So one of the issues I know we've been talking about just with our members and our specific community of anchors is that the problem might be that they don't always have the funding or the capacity to continue useful programs, right? Like things like hotspot lending or digital navigation services, things like that. And this is especially true when resources are either temporary or unstable. So we're kind of always battling, the need to step up and to help, but we need the resources to do that. So when it comes to an anchor's role specifically when increasing connectivity, I like to say that they need to be able to express their elevator pitch, if you will. So basically understanding, what services does their community need? What have they been doing? What's working? What's not working? What do they need to continue? And why does that work matter? So really trying to understand what they're doing and why does that matter? And then what do they need to continue that work in terms of funding and capacity and any other resources? Do they need to partner with others? Really sitting down and understanding what they're doing, what other resources are in the community, and how do they go and pitch that? How do they sell that? Oftentimes they might need to report back to their own board about what they're doing and how it's working and why they should continue that work. But they also might need to talk to state and local governments about where the resources are and why it matters. So, sometimes with anchors, they're really good at collecting the stories, and sometimes the stories of what they're doing and how they're impacting the community can help. But oftentimes they might need data. It really depends on who you're talking to and the person that's receiving the message and what will resonate with them. So I really can't sort of stress enough knowing your elevator pitch, and then understanding who you're talking to and what information that person or that foundation or government might need in order to help you sustain and grow your programs.
I'm going to pause in case anyone else wants to chime in on that question. If not, I am going to take us to the last section of this conversation. So just following the thread of what, community leaders can do. Amina, did you?
Sorry, Jisoo.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to put a plug in. One of the things that we had talked about in this community and others at the start of the pandemic was the importance of cataloging stories. So I just wanted to emphasize that there are so many really great ways for all of these ideas that we just heard, these innovative solutions, to be able to be lifted up, but also to catalog what's not working. So, earlier I was talking about how we have to shift potentially to acknowledge that, connectivity might be volatile. You're sort of at the whim of potential ISPs changing the terms and the cost of a service offering. Maybe it's low cost today, maybe it's not in another month. The same kind of protections that existed before won't exist. So being able to catalog what that means for education, what it means, for how many students you can serve, what innovations are left on the table because you just can't access them equitably, and to be able to have every student access that resource. So, being able to have a documentation of what is lost when we have this sort of volatile period without clear connectivity is going to be really valuable to making the case for making some of these solutions at the state level turn into solutions at scale, or potentially coming back to the federal level to have some wins on affordability and connectivity again.
Actually, your remarks actually tie in really nicely to the last part of this conversation, which is about coming back to policy and advocacy. And again, when I was at the federal government, speaking with advocates was very useful because I could leverage their data, their stories, their impact to make a case to leadership that policy areas that we need to really focus on. So, I'm going to actually go back to you. What advice do you have for, policymakers as well as advocates to ensure that, solutions are actually reaching the communities and stakeholders that are impacted the most? And can you tell me more about how different states that you've worked with have approached this issue?
Yeah, so in addition to the story gathering, that's definitely a tool that can be really useful. But for what? And I think there's some positive out there. Proactively, I think there are states like New York and California and Minnesota and others that are considering affordability programs at the state level through their legislature. Requiring a low cost requirement within their states. This is a really good development. It's a big hurdle to overcome. But in New York State, they've effectively been able to pass a law, survive challenges, and now it's going into implementation mode. The key during implementation mode for anybody from the GLR community that's in New York is to make sure there's actual uptake of the program, because what you don't want to have happen is a few years down the road, people sort of saying nobody used it. So, paying attention to those programs are going to be really vital. And then helping point them out to your community in your state if you're not in New York. So, at Common Sense, we're doing some work in trying to lift up the stories that are coming out of New York, identify other affordability legislation that's being moved through the states. There's, I think, some really positive pieces to try to scaffold as well at the federal level. So the BEAD program is still moving through. I think there's still an opportunity to ensure that some of the pieces that Bree mentioned, specifically around MDUs, still happens, and to support that. But then also at the state level, ensuring that you advocate to your state broadband offices to sort of remind them of the value. And for folks in the education community, again, the cataloging of your experience can be really instrumental in helping potentially tip the scales in favor of a decision that could utilize BEAD in the way that Bree was describing. And the other piece that was mentioned earlier that I think is super timely, potentially even this week or next week, is being heard in the House of Representatives on the Congressional Review Act that could end the E-rate hotspot program. And that's it's timely action. Every voice could really matter. Reaching out to your representative and telling them not to support that piece of legislation would be really helpful, because while there are other opportunities for potentially the FCC to push back on or change the E-rate hotspot lending program, the CRA is, as Kristen mentioned, particularly problematic because it could sort of salt the earth behind it and make it such that the FCC wouldn't be able to have a similar effort again. And then the last is on the Digital Equity Act. While the program has been ended effectively by the NTIA, there's still, some concerns around the legality of the way that they ended the program, and there may be an opportunity to challenge that. I think outreach, if your community or your organization could benefit from a program like the Digital Equity Act, having your voice heard by your member of Congress could be really helpful in lifting this up and helping push back on this decision. And then potentially also reaching out to NDIA, the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, who's trying to catalog who's been impacted by the loss of this program. That's particularly salient in light of, the advance of AI innovations into education, which could have been supported in terms of AI literacy programming for schools and libraries, could have been funded through the Digital Equity Act. And so there's a big loss that's really connected to all of the work that we're talking about right now, but also in the weeks ahead with the summer programming.
Thanks, Amina. Bree, I'm going to go to you and open up the question for the rest of the panel. This is sort of like what panel moderators like to call the magic wand question, right? What would you, make true to solve for the issue that we're talking about? So aside from maybe those that we've discussed, what are some major policies or programs that we need to focus on to make sure that we get all students the access that they need?
Thank you, Jisoo. And Amina, you outlined some really great critical actions that folks could take. One of the other elements in advocacy sort of pushes we're doing at Education Superhighway is around a permanent broadband benefit. So like Licia mentioned, some internet service providers are coming up with more affordable programs, and there's sort of a piecemeal affordability piece, but it's not comprehensive. And the Affordable Connectivity Program, ACP, was the most successful benefit program to date, and 23 million households, I believe, signed up in only a 2.5-year period. So it just shows how much that program was needed and how important it was. In December, EducationSuperHighway released a report that looks at what it could take for an affordable a permanent broadband benefit to endure and to be taken out of appropriations, so we don't see a similar thing happen with a permanent benefit. It's not dependent on funding for that year, and it's not taken out of it from an appropriations year, but rather embedded in other funding sources. And looking at, for example, the Universal Services Fund and ways in which programs that are sunsetting there could be moved over to fund programs such as this, really looking at the 16.3 million households I mentioned that have the internet access, have the infrastructure, but don't can't afford it, and they're going to continue to not be able to afford it. So if you, I think Hillary's going to drop the link in a moment, but at the bottom, there's also a call to action. It gives a lot more detail of what the benefit could look like, who it could serve, how the funding could be leveraged. But the most critical piece being advocates on the ground, such as yourselves, contacting your federal representatives, telling those stories, sharing that data. And I think Amina had really mentioned the story piece, and Kristen, the data piece. Those two elements are so critical because it shows the difference between what it meant to be connected and versus not, and what the difference would make in their constituents' lives. So the hope is that they'll pay attention. The hope is that they're given a roadmap, or at least something to consider to discuss with their colleagues when they recognize that their constituents are not accessing the internet any longer, and that universal goal of universal access is not going to be realized. The divide will keep on widening, and affordability has to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, that conversation around the need for a permanent affordability benefit was also echoed by our state members that contributed to the UCI report that I talked about. So it's one of our major policy recommendations there. On this sort of magic wand question, I'll pause for anyone else that wants to chime in. And this time I'll make sure to wait long enough time so that I don't cut anyone off. I think that was the magic 7 seconds that cues me to the next question. So Amina, before we get to audience Q&A, help us close out. What's one thing that the community leaders that are in the audience today can do now to continue advocating for state and federal programs that the panelists talked about today?
I'm going to ask you to do two things in that one. I'd say the one thing right off the top is to have your voice heard on the CRA issue in the House. It's just so critical, so timely this week, next week. So that's, a really wonderful way to engage. The second is cataloging your stories, maintaining that data, in finding a way to do that in conjunction with maybe how you're rolling out new products or new innovations within your community. So for example, if you are putting together guidance around AI, if you're putting together professional development resources, literacy resources, planning to use AI in the classroom or with students, also taking some time to have some questions and feedback around connectivity. And trying to connect the dots between students who, will tell the story of, what it means for students who have, connectivity at home, access devices, high quality connectivity at home, uninterrupted access to connectivity, and what difference it makes in terms of like their usage of these types of innovations and these tools. I think will make a big difference. I specifically call out AI in particular because there is so much focus on it these days, but also because I think it has particular resonance with policymakers, both at the state and federal level. So I think it's a good way of connecting the dots on any kind of story or resource that you bring to the table.
Thank you so much. In the last 15 minutes or so, I'm going to transition us to the audience Q&A. So I'm looking at the Q&A box provided by Zoom. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to use that Q&A function to drop those questions in. But I'm going to go to the first one that I see, which I think talks about the role of the private sector here. Given the current federal funding freeze, are you aware of any pathways for companies with innovative solutions that bridge the digital divide to collaborate with community organizations or philanthropic foundations, especially opportunities to pilot these solutions in rural or remote communities? I have an answer to this about something that I've seen before, but before I chime in, just want to turn it to our panelists. Like, are there opportunities for companies or private sector folks to, chime in on this conversation?
That's not specific to connectivity, but I have an example of one related to devices. So, we saw during the pandemic and after an opportunity for refurbished devices to enter into the hands of students. There was a crunch on that during the pandemic, but I think it's opened up since then. And so, I think it's one thing, again, to sort of consider, if you can, for folks who can remember all the way back to 2019, some of the resources that you used to reach out to, I think it's valuable to consider, doing those types of outreach again. So I think working with businesses or corporate community partners who might be able to offer refurbished devices or even help support some of the digital inclusion programs in your community would be a really good option.
Anything else from folks?
I'll just jump in here and just reiterate, point from earlier that, anchor institutions often have, really good intentions for different programs and, trying to keep students specifically and library patrons connected, but oftentimes they might not have those resources, right? Like those devices, but they might have, ways in which that they can partner with these organizations. So, surely just finding ways to develop those partnerships and using those institutions that know the community needs as a way to understand how you can help, right? Start that conversation. What resources do you have and what are the needs that they know about and how can you, partner together?
I think the concrete example that I was going to chime in with, so CETA is collaborating with the Council of Chief State School Officers and the Balmer Foundation to provide some state education agencies with pilot grants to work with the social sector and the private sector to pilot, innovative connectivity solutions in different areas. And I know that a couple of states have proposed those ideas. So yeah, there are collaborations in place to pilot those types of things that I've seen. And one example is our collaboration with CCSSO right now. This next question, I'd be really interested to see if someone has a response to this one. I have an angle on it, but how much do truancy reduction efforts systematically connect to the lack of digital resources in the household? And this one's particularly interesting because I see the link going in the reverse direction, right? The households that are connected and have better levels of digital access. We know from the research that definitely supports, student well-being, right? And we know that student well-being has a connection to their engagement with school, right? So it's not that, digital access just sets a foundation for academic achievement, but it also sets a foundation for overall student well-being and family supports as well. So there's definitely a link there. I don't know exactly about truancy efforts, that have shown an impact on the reverse direction, the digital resources. Yeah.
I mean, one thing I can bring up is that, we had heard that for communities who had been in the digital divide, especially for students whose parents were also in the digital divide and not as tech savvy, having connectivity to the home, sometimes through students, helped create a stronger connection between parents and teachers. So sort of strengthening that school to parent connection, because a lot of times those communications have moved into using some kind of application or technology. And for parents who are sort of out of using those, either aren't tech savvy or just don't have the connectivity, a lot of those resources sort of miss them. And so, again, another reason why that fundamental layer of having connectivity to the home can be really helpful, because it ensures not only is the student connected and doing homework, but that you've got a good pathway to connect between the parents and the teachers.
At least in the Q&A box as of right now, I don't see any further audience questions, but feel free to continue adding them in, because we do have a couple minutes left in this webinar. But I want to sort of build on what Amina said about the role of parents and ask you all a question around that. What role can parents, families, caregivers play in advocating for better digital access and literacy? How can they become critical stakeholders in this conversation?
I mean, I can start, please, other colleagues jump in. But I think at the end of the day, parents are such amazing advocates for their children, for their students, for their communities. Schools work so closely with parents and guardians and families around inextricably linked and insurmountable issues, and we get through it each time. And so parents are such an incredible, and families and their guardians are such incredible resources. I think that one of the main pieces is to continue to share stories, continue to advocate, demonstrate how this has this lack of access, for instance, has real impacts on your students' learning, on your, even at the holistic family unit, about workforce development and job attainment and telehealth and all the security, social safety net, all the pieces that became so acute during the pandemic, but have always persisted and will continue to persist. So those calls to action, talking about solutions with schools and with your teachers and families, I think we'll just be continuing to have that conversation is so important, and continuing to be the amazing advocates that you already are for your students. But this way, we're equipping with the data, the stories, and the vehicles and avenues to really leverage that.
Yeah, I think that there's like a really interesting connection on connectivity for parents, because most students probably don't know the details of their connectivity at home. They may think they're even connected because, they've got a cell phone, the cell phone's working. And we know that mobile devices aren't good enough. Mobile connectivity is not necessarily good enough for them to be able to do their work at home effectively. So parents can be a really important resource to build that relationship with, to be able to keep track of where they are in that connectivity journey. And they're going to know the details potentially, but also like being prepared to do a little bit of digital literacy for parents can be a really important way of making sure that they can serve as that resource. So they themselves may not be 100% sure of what they've got and what they don't have. But, I think they are really interested in making sure that their student is well supported in their education. So, with a little bit of work, I think you could have a really great ally in making sure that, you will have a sense of what kind of connectivity and resources a student has at home. And then you'll be able to target, whatever your curriculum is to meet the needs and be effective.
I've also seen districts and states engage the parent and caregiver community as they do their state EdTech planning or district EdTech planning to make sure that that group of stakeholders heard and their sentiments are reflected in the plan. I think the only thing that I'll add is when it comes to families and caregivers that are most impacted by digital access issues, we might have to look for different ways of engaging them than expecting them to just like come to a 4 p.m. parents meeting and expecting them to all participate, right? And during, when states were doing digital equity planning, for example, they found really creative ways to go out into the communities to get that kind of feedback. So I think that's something that I'll add from what I've seen from different initiatives. Bree, I know you want to chime in on that first question about the role of private sectors and how they can, help solve the digital access divide. So do you want to add more on that?
Thank you, Jisoo. And really quickly, because I know there's another question, but for the question around the corporate opportunities and sort of how corporations can help and companies can help, states are actually still doing really innovative things too with their funding, state funding. For example, Massachusetts is using state funds to launch their own MDU program, like I mentioned, and managed service providers and internet service providers were the principal applicants. And there was a lot of attention paid to the willingness to incorporate other digital equity elements. So device distribution, digital navigation elements, digital literacy skills and training. So while the federal landscape has some bleak options right now, the states are doing some really amazing work. So just to name off a couple, being New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Texas, others are doing really amazing work locally. So there still could be options for entities to do this from a private sector lens.
Thank you. Going to Kimberly's question in the Q&A. This is a really interesting one. I've been working in the district and every child has an iPad. They use them so often, digital worksheets. How can we keep this from happening if they take them home? So the devices are used to enrich the learning experience. And she added, as opposed to just being busy work, right? And this is actually something that we talk about in the 2024 National EdTech Plan as well, the difference between passive learning experiences and active learning experiences, right? The sort of the easy way out when it comes to technology is to use them for passive learning experiences where technology isn't being used to sort of augment or transform the learning experience, right? We're using digital worksheets or just simple PowerPoints and expect folks to just like consume a video or an online textbook. And we're just replicating what could have been done in the paper and pencil format in a digital setting, right? As opposed to really active learning experiences where students are conducting research, building workforce ready skills, and leveraging their creativity to build something and engage in the learning experience with agency, right? So I encourage you to check out the National Ed Tech Plan. I'll post that link in the chat in just a second because the original link actually has been taken down by the administration. So I encourage you to check out the examples of the active learning experiences that are highlighted in the NETP. But I'll also turn that question over to our panelists while I look for the link of the NETP. Anyone would like to chime in on this one?
I mean, we at Common Sense Media, I'm not the expert at my team on this, but we are updating our curriculum around digital literacy. So it does have, a bunch of resources on sort of strategies to use technology in a way that really helps for more like deeper engagement with educational resources and technology, and not just sort of a paper replacement. So I'm happy to drop the link in the chat of our curriculum, but I do want to just flag that it's to be updated shortly.
I think we have 2 minutes left, just checking the Q&A in case we have anything else. I'll just ask one closing question. And I think there's a lot going on at the federal and state levels. And I think that's like the understatement of the day, right? Especially in this political climate. And it can be draining for a lot of advocates to step up in this time. So where would you suggest, spending your energy, if you're an advocate, if you're a community leader, to make sure that you have the biggest impact?
I mean, I think, there is a lot of potential depth to a relationship that you build at the state or local level. So starting local is always a great place to start because that's where you could have like the longest relationship and the most lasting impact. And it doesn't mean that that work doesn't translate into something that can be helpful to like bigger federal initiatives. So like I said, all of the sort of data gathering, story collection, all of that done even at the local level. These are really great data points or stories, case studies that can be used for similar action that we hope to see done at scale at the federal level.
Anyone else? Well, thank you all to the panelists for this wonderful conversation over the last hour and a half. There's so much to cover, so much going on nowadays, but I hope the audience took away something that they can, implement right away or, continue advocating for, came back with sort of a rejuvenated mindset when it came to policy and advocacy issues. Hillary, should I turn it back to you just to close us out with these resources?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the message of the day, Jisoo, is we have to continue to advocate. We can't get tired of the message of telling our stories, of building those important relationships, because connectivity isn't something that's solved. It still matters. And we still need to be talking about both infrastructure and the practical cost for people, and then be innovative in that space. It's about trust and inclusion, empowering youth. And so we want to thank you for joining us today. We also want to encourage you that if you heard something that you're going to use in your own context, in your own community, please let us know what that is. I just dropped the form for that in the chat. We also encourage you to continue this conversation with us by joining the Campaign for Grade Level Reading in June and July as we host our Technology Enhanced Teaching and Learning Summer Institute, which we will dive into some of these topics that we just barely brushed more and more. We also have a series of other sessions coming up, so please register to join them. And really, as we close our session today, I want to say thank you to all of our panelists for the reminders of what makes a difference as we work to close the gaps for students and parents, for your time, for your investment, and the work that you do every day to make a difference for our young people. So thank you all so much for joining us today.